Hey there, Sleepless Rabble. Tonight, we've got one of the big ones. A classic from the dark side of California. You've heard the name before. Whispered, cursed, printed on every true crime mug since the 80s. Richard Ramirez. Yeah, another Richard. I swear, statistically, that name alone should come with a background check. Anyway, this particular Richard didn't just flirt with darkness, he dated it. He had what you could call an intimate relationship with Satan, and apparently a very active nightlife. The press called him the Night Stalker. Police called him a nightmare with sneakers. And we're about to go deeper than any Netflix special ever dared to. Because beneath the headlines and pentagrams lies a story that's not just about murder, but about trauma, obsession, and a brain that might have been short-circuited long before he ever broke into anyone's home. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's take a slow walk through the twisted corridors of Richard Ramirez, the man who became the darkness he worshipped. Today, we'd like to shout out Linda Spears. She's our absolute delight. She likes, comments, and actually interacts with our videos, which is not only super important, but means the world to us. So Linda, thank you. Tonight's story is dedicated to you. So dear listeners, don't be a Karen. Be a Linda and show some love. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to the Richard Ramirez Deep Dive. El Paso, Texas, 1960. A border city where the air itself feels like it's trying to escape. Where religion sweats through every brick wall, and the desert sun doesn't just tan you, it sterilizes your dreams. It's the kind of place where the devil doesn't need to knock. He just moves in quietly and gets a job at the rail yard. That's where Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez took his first breath, and according to everyone who met him later, the air probably shivered a little. He was the youngest of 5 kids, born on a leap day, February 29th, 1960. Already a cosmic glitch. Born on a day that barely exists. Destined to spend most birthdays technically illegal. The universe has a cruel sense of humor. His father, Julian, was a former Juarez policeman turned construction worker. The kind of man who measured manhood in decibels. Every day, he crossed the border for work, came home, exhausted, and released whatever remained of his temper inside their 2-bedroom house. Discipline meant fists, and in that house, everything was built from anger. The walls, the silence, the way the kids learned not to breathe too loud. His mother, Mercedes, worked in a boot factory, back when occupational safety was still considered communist propaganda. The air inside was thick with chemical fumes. Doctors would later suspect that exposure contributed to the birth defects and neurological issues seen in several of her children. By the time Richard came along, Mercedes had already endured multiple difficult pregnancies and stillbirths. The factory didn't stop for that. Neither did the rent. 2 serious head injuries marked his early childhood, one at 2 years old when a dresser fell on him, another at 5 when a swing knocked him unconscious. Doctors noted both incidents. Soon after, the seizures began. Epilepsy in children is common, but combine it with repeated trauma, poverty, and nightly violence, and you get something that rewires a brain like faulty Christmas lights. He'd wake up trembling, confused, sometimes violent. Neighbors later said the boy's eyes looked gone, even when he was awake. School offered no relief. Teachers remembered a quiet kid who stared through people, not at them. He'd fall asleep in class, wander off mid-lesson, sometimes disappear for days. He loved cemeteries, not goth love, not aesthetic, real love. He slept there to escape his father. Imagine being 10 years old and finding peace among headstones because at least the dead didn't yell. There's a clinical pattern psychologists like to draw lines around now. Childhood head trauma plus abuse plus social neglect equals heightened risk of antisocial disorder. In 1960s Texas, though, nobody drew charts. You just prayed harder. By 12, Richard was skipping school and stealing food. The police saw a brown kid from a poor neighborhood. Textbook case of not our problem. They'd catch him, scare him a little, send him home to the same place that made him run. Rinse, repeat, escalate. And then, like some biblical plague disguised as family, cousin Miguel, Mike Ramirez, returned from Vietnam. A Green Beret, decorated damaged, and carrying souvenirs that should have been burned. Mike's version of therapy involved showing Richard Polaroids, dozens of them, of Vietnamese women he'd raped and murdered during the war. He told stories with the precision of a man giving a workshop. Where to aim, how to hold a knife, how a body twitches when hit just right. He called it education. And Richard, barely a teenager, absorbed every word. He didn't flinch, he studied. Because when you grow up around pain, horror stops being shocking. It becomes familiar. Mike called him Little Richie. They smoked weed together, shared beers, laughed at war stories that should have been confessions. Some evenings, Mike cleaned his guns on the table while Richard sat silently beside him, mesmerized by the gleam of metal and the calm it seemed to bring. The boy who had been powerless at home was learning from a man who had turned power into ritual. Then came 1973, the year innocence left the building entirely. Richard was 13, sitting on the couch while Mike and his wife, Jessie, argued. It started like every other argument, shouting, threats, tears, until Mike went to the bedroom, came back with a revolver and shot Jessie in the face, point blank, right in front of Richard. He didn't scream, didn't run, didn't even blink. He just watched, as if reality had slipped out of focus. Mike calmly sat down next to the corpse and lit a cigarette. When police arrived, Richard was still there, pale and frozen, like someone had pressed pause on his soul. Mike's defense, post-traumatic stress. He was institutionalized for a few years, received treatment, and was released. No real justice, no therapy for the kid who witnessed it. Richard just learned that you could kill someone, say you were traumatized, and eventually go home. Lesson absorbed. After that, the switch flipped for good. Richard stopped caring about school. He stopped caring about anything. He wandered El Paso streets at night, slept in parks or cemeteries, shoplifted for food. His family, already exhausted, didn't fight it. How do you discipline a ghost? He started wearing black, carrying knives, talking less. Friends would later say he seemed calm, too calm, like a storm waiting for permission. At 14, he began referring to nighttime as his time. The kid who used to hide from violence was now imitating it. Because once you've seen the worst thing possible and survived, everything else just looks like rehearsal. And Miguel Ramirez, the cousin who brought his ghost home, had unknowingly passed one on. After Jesse's murder, something in Richard Ramirez's brain, and soul, if you believe in those, simply stopped downloading empathy updates. He drifted out of school the same way smoke drifts out of a burning room. Slow, silent, inevitable. By the time he was 15, classrooms, homework, even curfews were distant concepts that belonged to other people. He wasn't rebelling anymore. He just checked out. He spent most days lurking around bus stations, gas stations, arcades, anywhere fluorescent lights hummed, and no one asked for ID. His father still tried to discipline him occasionally, But by then, Richard had mastered the art of the blank stare. He'd look through you, not at you. There's no punishment for someone who already feels untouchable. When home wasn't an option, and it rarely was, he stayed with his older brother Reuben and Reuben's wife. A terrible combination for a damaged teenager. Reuben was into petty crime, quick money, and shortcuts. His wife, however, was into Richard. She flirted with him openly, blurring what few boundaries the boy still understood. If you're looking for the exact moment he stopped seeing human connection as sacred, this might be it. By 16, he'd left home for good. El Paso faded behind him like a bad dream, replaced by abandoned houses, desert nights, and occasional generosity from strangers who didn't yet know what kind of story they were stepping into. He started stealing food, sleeping under bridges, and talking to himself. The seizures still came, sudden and violent, followed by confusion and blackouts. Medical experts today would call it temporal lobe epilepsy, often linked to sudden aggression, hallucinations, and dissociation. But in 1970s, Texas, you didn't go to therapy for brain trauma. You went to church or jail. Sometimes both. Drugs entered his life around this time, first as a distraction, then as a lifestyle. Marijuana, then LSD, because nothing says stable coping mechanism like psychedelic exploration with untreated neurological damage. The acid didn't open his third eye. It set fire to whatever was left of the first two. He started talking about lights that pulsed in patterns, whispers that slid under his skin. He said he could see energy. No one asked what that meant, because everyone already assumed he was weird. When you combine repeated head trauma, trauma exposure, drug use, and sleep deprivation, the brain starts rewriting reality. For Richard, that rewrite came with sound effects. He began to believe. That darkness had a voice, a low hum that grew louder when the world was asleep. He called it the night. The night, he said, didn't judge him. The night didn't hit him or ask questions. It simply existed. And so did he, within it. He worked odd jobs, but none lasted long. There was a brief stint at a Holiday Inn where he was fired after attempting to assault a female guest. The husband intervened, the police came, and then, in a twist of bureaucratic tragedy, they let him go because the couple were tourists who'd already left town. One more sliding door left open. He began breaking into houses, not to rob, at least not at first, but to be inside, to feel the air of a place that wasn't his. He'd slip through windows, stand in the dark, and just breathe. Later, he said he liked the energy. That's how he described it. Not the thrill, not the fear, the energy. He'd sometimes take small items, jewelry, trinkets, photos, tokens of other people's peace. Somewhere around 17, he discovered the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey. For most readers, it was a piece of countercultural theatre. For Richard, it was revelation. The idea that the indulgence was power, that rebellion was purity. It sounded like scripture written specifically for him. He stopped seeing Satan as a metaphor and started treating him as a mentor. The devil doesn't judge, he said later. That's what I liked about him. He carried the book everywhere, right next to his hunting knife and a stolen camera. At night, he'd break into empty homes just to take pictures. Half-open doors, sleeping shapes through curtains, mirrors catching his shadow. He wasn't stealing, he was documenting, collecting proof that he could enter your world anytime he wanted. Those who knew him during this period described a strange duality. Calm, polite, even shy by day. But at night, he'd vanish for hours, and return with that electric stillness that only adrenaline can create. Some friends thought he was tripping constantly. Others said he looked like someone who'd seen something he liked too much. By 18, he'd already learned how to disappear. Hitchhiking became his default transportation. He drifted through Texas, Arizona, eventually landing in California, a place where every broken soul eventually ends up. Because the weather is good and the anonymity is better. Los Angeles in the early 80s was a paradox. Neon glam on the surface, decay underneath. It was a city full of dreams and dumpsters, of Hollywood smiles and alleyway screams. For Richard, it felt like home immediately. Nobody asked questions here. Nobody cared. He started with small burglaries, radios, cash, jewelry, and spent nights sleeping in stolen cars or cheap motels. But the crimes weren't about money. They were rehearsals. He was testing doors, testing fate, testing himself. Some nights, he said later, he'd wake up miles away with no memory of how he got there. The blackouts never left him. They simply became convenient. Because in that empty space between memory and reality, he could do anything and call it something else. Psychologists later suggested that these fugue states might have made it easier for him to dissociate from violence. In his mind, the night did it. He was just the vessel. And somewhere between those acid trips, those seizures, and those hours spent staring into strangers' windows, the boy from El Paso stopped being a runaway. He became something else. Something that moved through cities like smoke, unnoticed, shapeless, patient. The night had found its apprentice. By 1984, Los Angeles had that particular kind of rot that smells like perfume. A place where people moved fast enough to outrun their own shadows. Coke dust in the club bathrooms, televangelists on TV promising salvation in exchange for your visa number, and serial killers apparently growing on trees. It was the perfect breeding ground for a man like Richard Ramirez. Invisible, transient, and increasingly certain that the night had chosen him for something bigger. He was 24 and already running on fumes. His diet consisted of junk food, sugar, and drugs. His teeth were starting to rot, his skin pale, his mind oscillating in between blackout and obsession. He drifted through California like a ghost with bus fare, sleeping in cars, abandoned buildings, and the occasional motel that didn't ask for ID. He'd been breaking into houses for years by now. But what began as voyeurism had evolved. The boundaries between fantasy and reality were dissolving. He didn't just want to watch. He wanted to feel that same pulse he'd seen in his cousin's Polaroids all those years ago. The one that said you're in control now. In April 1984, 9-year-old Mei Leung disappeared from her San Francisco apartment building. She was later found in the basement, assaulted and strangled with her own shirt. The case went unsolved for decades, but when DNA technology caught up, the match pointed straight back to him. It would become his first known murder. Back then, it was just another tragedy that disappeared beneath headlines about Reagan and MTV. That same year, he drifted back south to Los Angeles, a city he seemed magnetically drawn to, maybe because it reflected him so perfectly. On the surface, bright and promising. Underneath, hollow and hungry. He was living off petty thefts, sleeping in cheap rooms, wandering at night. People who saw him described a tall man in black, gaunt face, staring eyes. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was about fate, or Satan, or energy. Words that sound poetic until you realize he meant them literally. Because by then, Richard Ramirez wasn't just a man who liked the dark. He believed he was of it. The satanic imagery that would later define him wasn't an act, at least not entirely. He'd been reading Anton LaVey's The Satanic Bible since his teens. But LaVey's philosophy was more libertarian theater than demon worship. A celebration of self-interest, indulgence, and personal will. It was a middle finger to organized religion, not an invitation to slaughter. Ramirez, however, read it through a broken lens. He didn't see irony or metaphor. He saw permission. Where LaVey wrote about rejecting guilt, Ramirez saw justification for cruelty. Where LaVey dismissed the idea of literal evil, Ramirez embraced it like a career path. He began carrying pentagrams in his pockets, carving them into walls, drawing them on his own skin. He told people he was a soldier for Satan, though in truth, he probably couldn't have explained what that meant. The Church of Satan later condemned him, publicly clarifying that they had nothing to do with him, which frankly says a lot when even the Satanists are distancing themselves. But symbols are powerful, especially to someone who's built his entire identity around fear. Ramirez liked how they made people react. He liked the power of a gasp, the freeze in someone's eyes when they saw the mark. He didn't need belief. He needed control, and the night gave him that. July 1984, Glassell Park, Los Angeles. A small apartment. 79-year-old Jenny Vinco, asleep with her TV humming beside her bed. When her son arrived the next morning, the window was shattered. She'd been stabbed repeatedly, her throat so deeply cut that police said she was nearly decapitated. Nothing valuable was missing. Just drawers pulled open, the faint scent of something wrong lingering in the air. It was the first murder officially linked to the man the press would one day call the Night Stalker. But in that moment, it was just one more horror in a city already numbed by headlines. The detectives who saw the scene noticed something odd. He didn't take money or jewelry. He took time, he lingered, moved things, touched things. He wasn't robbing, he was participating. Afterwards, Ramirez walked through the streets barefoot, shoes dangling from his hand. Witnesses later recalled a man like that near the crime scene. Tall, thin, with eyes like holes. But Los Angeles is full of strange people at night. Nobody looked twice. He spent the next months refining his routine, watching, learning, testing locks. He'd park near freeways, wander through neighborhoods, memorize the rhythm of sleeping houses. He wasn't hunting specific victims. He was looking for opportunity, for permission. People always say serial killers have a pattern. Ramirez didn't. He was chaos with sneakers. His choices made no sense, rich or poor, young or old, any race, any background. The only constant was the time. Always night, always quiet, always fear. He believed the devil was guiding him, that his victims were chosen. But psychologists later called it something else. Disorganized psychopathy. The kind that feeds on impulse, not ritual. The pentagrams and satanic posturing weren't religious. They were theater. The ultimate rebellion in a world he thought had never listened to him. He once told a reporter, Satan represents what's natural in all of us. Maybe he believed that. Or maybe he just needed a name big enough to hide behind. Because by 1985, the killings weren't just crimes anymore. They were his sermons. By the spring of 1985, Los Angeles had become a city that prayed without believing. You could feel it, that static hum of unease that lingers before a storm. Something was out there. And though no one knew his name yet, everyone was already leaving lights on and double-locking doors that never mattered before. Richard Ramirez had fully crossed the line. The petty burglar from El Paso was gone. What remained was a creature built from sleep deprivation, rage, and cheap cigarettes. He was still bouncing between flophouses, freeways, and the Cecil Hotel downtown, a building that was already halfway to myth. A place where even the walls sighed. It didn't care who came or why, only that they paid in cash and didn't die on the carpet. It was from there and other motels like it that he began his nocturnal pilgrimages. He would leave barefoot or in worn Avia sneakers, dressed in black. A .22 revolver in one pocket and a knife in the other. The city slept, and he went hunting. March 17th, 1985, Maria Hernandez pulls her car into the garage of her Rosemead townhouse. The light flickers. A man steps from the shadows. He lifts his gun. She raises her keys by instinct, by miracle, and the bullet ricochets off the metal. She survives. Her roommate, Dale Okazaki, upstairs, isn't so lucky. One shot to the head. She never hears his name, never knows she's become part of something larger. Within the same hour, across town, 22-year-old Veronica Yu is dragged from her car and shot twice. No robbery, no motive, just randomness, pure and clean. The police don't connect them. Not yet, but the city feels it. Like an animal sensing a predator before seeing it. 10 days later, another quiet neighborhood. Whittier. Vincent and Maxine Zazara. He's killed first, shot in his sleep. She fights back. She fights hard. The crime scene will make even seasoned detectives go silent. Ramirez mutilates her body, carves pentagrams into walls, steals her eyes. A grotesque parody of religious ritual. He tells himself he's doing Satan's work. In truth, he's just escalating, testing how far the void will stretch before it swallows him too. The media hasn't connected the dots, but the energy in Los Angeles changes. Dogs bark more at night. Windows close earlier. Gun stores can't restock fast enough. The local hardware shops run out of deadbolts and crucifixes in the same week. Churches report record attendance. Even the atheists start muttering prayers before bed. Ramirez doesn't care. He moves through neighborhoods like Fog, Monterey Park, Arcadia, Diamond Bar, Burbank, Glendale. He attacks men and women, rich and poor, elderly and young. He shoots, stabs, bludgeons, assaults, leaves pentagrams behind like graffiti. There's no pattern because he doesn't need one. Chaos is the point. He once told a cellmate later that he loved seeing the fear in their eyes, the realization. It wasn't about lust or greed. It was about the instant he became their god, the moment between life and death when control transferred entirely to him. That was the only prayer he ever understood. Detectives started noticing a recurring signature. The same gun, the same shoe print, size 11.5 Avia sneaker. A brand so obscure that only one store in Los Angeles even sold that model. But before they could trace it, the press leaked it. And suddenly, half the paranoid men in the city were stomping around in identical shoes. If irony could bleed, this was the moment it did. By June, it was undeniable. Los Angeles had a serial killer. The media named him the Night Stalker, a title that fit too well. The words alone made people sleep worse. The city became a crime scene with streetlights. The murder map stretched from San Francisco to Mission Viejo, each red pin a small scream in cartographic form. Detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo, veterans of the Hillside Strangler case, took the lead. They worked 18-hour days, chain-smoking over photographs and maps. Their office looked like a murder museum curated by exhaustion. The bodies kept coming. Mary Cannon, Joyce Nelson, Florence Lang, William Dewey. The names blurred. The method didn't. A shadow entering homes through open windows, leaving behind nothing but terror and pentagrams. Forensic techs collected fingerprints, bullets, fibers, even shoe impressions. Nothing matched anyone in the system. Ramirez was still a ghost, one with terrible hygiene and a frightening work ethic. Meanwhile, Satan was getting better PR than he'd had in decades. Tabloids framed Ramirez as a literal devil worshipper, quoting every "Hail Satan" he muttered, amplifying it until it sounded like a movement. America loved it. Church attendance skyrocketed. Talk shows debated whether heavy metal was breeding killers. Anton LaVey himself publicly condemned Ramirez, but the headlines didn't care. Evil sells. Through July and August, Ramirez continued almost nightly. He left pentagrams on walls, said prayers to the prince, and sometimes forced victims to swear allegiance to Satan before killing them. Survivors described his eyes as black, dead, and glittering. They all said the same thing. He looked gone. The city stopped pretending it was safe. Women slept with knives, men with shotguns, children with lights on. Nighttime, once romantic, became radioactive. But Ramirez wasn't just terrorizing Los Angeles. He was enjoying the attention. Newspapers had turned him into folklore. The Night Stalker was now myth, a dark celebrity, stalking headlines as much as houses. And that, ironically, made him sloppy. Because the devil might grant confidence, but he doesn't grant common sense. The mob had left him bruised and bleeding, but alive, which was more than could be said for anyone who'd crossed him before. When officers shoved him into the back seat, Ramirez looked less like a monster and more like a man who'd finally run out of night. At Hollenbeck Station, the press was already waiting. Helicopters hovered overhead, cameras flashing through barred windows. Reporters shouted his name like it was a rock concert. Inside, detectives were running on pure adrenaline and disbelief. The killer who'd haunted California for over a year was sitting right there, cuffed, smiling, blood drying on his face. He didn't resist, didn't confess either. He just stared at the wall, calm, detached, as if this was all part of the plan. When one officer muttered, "You know who you are, don't you?" Ramirez smiled. "Yeah," he said. "But do you?" The mugshots were taken that same evening. The famous ones. Eyes half-lidded, smirk curling, hair hanging like a black halo. When the photos hit the wire, they sold more papers than the Olympics. Evil, it turned out, had excellent bone structure. The next morning, he was moved to the county facility downtown. Protesters lined the streets, holding signs that said, "Feed him to Satan," and "No mercy for the devil." Inside, guards had to rotate constantly. Too many wanted a chance to hit him. Ramirez seemed to enjoy it. Every threat, every insult, every camera flash, fuel. The interrogation tapes show him bored, almost amused. He answered questions with riddles or silence. Sometimes he'd close his eyes mid-sentence and hum softly, like a man praying to static. Detectives tried everything: intimidation, mockery, appeals to decency. He just smirked. When asked why he killed, he said, "Why not? Everybody has to pay." Psychologists were brought in. Some saw narcissistic personality disorder. Others saw psychosis. One called him a blend of sadist and mystic, which sounds poetic until you remember what that means. His EEG still showed traces of seizure activity. The same damaged neural rhythms from childhood. The science was there, but sympathy wasn't. By the third day, the press had officially turned him into a religion. The Los Angeles Times ran front-page spreads titled "Face of Evil." TV anchors spoke of Satan as if he'd opened a branch office downtown. Evangelists shouted that America had invited the devil in through heavy metal and horror movies. A new moral panic was born overnight. Ramirez just basked in it. He'd glance at the TV coverage and laugh. "They get it," he said once to a guard. "They finally get it." When he was arraigned a week later, hundreds of people crowded the courthouse steps. Some screamed for the death penalty, others just wanted to look. He entered the courtroom barefoot, one last theatrical flourish, and winked at the cameras. It was all performance, and he was finally on stage. The judge ordered a psychiatric evaluation. The experts called him sane enough to stand trial, which, legally speaking, was another way of saying we'd rather kill you than explain you. In those first months of detention, his fame metastasized. T-shirts, posters, bootleg cassette tapes of news reports. Someone even started selling "Hail Satan" bumper stickers. The Night Stalker wasn't just a criminal anymore, he was a brand. Meanwhile, detectives kept sifting through his life. The trail led back through stolen cars, pawn shops, and then the motels. That's when the Cecil Hotel kept popping up. Receipts, witness statements, laundry slips. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. One detective later said, "We didn't find Satan in his room. We found mildew still. Everyone knew where they had to go next." And so, the investigation team took the elevator to the 14th floor of the Cecil, the place where the devil had slept in borrowed sheets. When the sirens faded and the headlines turned triumphant, the city exhaled, or tried to. The monster was caught, the devil unmasked, the streets supposedly safe again. But the truth was uglier. The fear didn't leave with him. It just moved back into the walls. The police went back through his trail, tracing every motel, every flop house, every trash bin he'd ever touched. And there it was. The Cecil Hotel. The name kept reappearing, like a watermark on all his nights. Room 1412. Top floor. Paid weekly, cash only. When they opened the door, the air hit them like a confession. Cigarette smoke, mildew, cheap cologne, something metallic underneath. Not a shrine, not a satanic altar, just filth. The kind that comes from someone who doesn't believe in tomorrow. The sheets were stiff with stains. The sink was clogged with black water. On the nightstand, a Gideon Bible and a cracked mirror. Detectives said it felt less like a crime scene and more like a residue. The room wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by absence. The Cecil had been built in the 1920s as a luxury hotel for businessmen. By the time Ramirez checked in, it was a vertical graveyard, a ruin pretending to have front desk service. The marble lobby still gleamed in patches, like it remembered what wealth used to feel like. But above the 3rd floor, the elevator doors opened into despair. It had become a magnet for the lost. Addicts, drifters, runaways, the newly unemployed. People who didn't exist on paper. A perfect ecosystem for a predator who preferred silence. Nobody noticed when he came in barefoot at 4 a.m. Nobody cared when he dumped blood-spattered clothes in the dumpster. If you lived at the Cecil, minding your own business wasn't just etiquette, it was survival. Later, one tenant said she'd seen him returning after sunrise, smiling to himself. Another claimed he washed his hands for 10 minutes straight in the communal sink, whispering. None of it made it into police reports, because really, what part of that was unusual there? The Cecil's legend didn't start with him, but he made sure it would never end. After his arrest, journalists descended on the building like flies. They called it Satan's Motel. Tabloids printed photos of its cracked facade under headlines like Room 1412, Where the Devil Slept. Tourists began showing up, asking which elevator he used. The management scrubbed the walls, painted over everything, changed the locks. Still, the whispers stayed. And then, decades later, it happened again. Elisa Lam, 21, vanished inside that same hotel. The security footage showed her in the elevator, confused, frightened, pressing buttons like she was trying to escape something unseen. Days later, she was found in the rooftop water tank. The internet exploded. Theories multiplied. Possession, ghosts, curses, Ramirez's energy. Netflix made documentaries. Podcasters analyzed her final gestures frame by frame. Everyone wanted the Cecil to explain itself, as if concrete could confess. But the building didn't need to speak. It had been telling the same story for a century. This is where forgotten people go to vanish. Ramirez wasn't the first ghost that checked in there, and he wouldn't be the last. The hotel didn't create monsters. It just gave them somewhere to hide. And maybe that's the truest horror of all. Not that evil exists, but that it can always find affordable accommodation. When the renovation crews came years later, they stripped the wallpaper, replaced the carpets, renamed the place, tried to erase the history. Still, guests swore the air felt heavy. The elevators hesitated. The lights flickered more than physics should allow. Some places remember, some places feed, and the Cecil never slept again. When the cell door closed behind him, the noise outside didn't stop. It just changed pitch. Reporters, cameras, late-night hosts, and an entire culture addicted to spectacle. The Night Stalker was gone from the streets, but he was everywhere else. In the holding cells of Los Angeles County Jail, Ramirez finally got what he'd always wanted. Attention. Not from the voices in his head, not from the devil he invoked, but from the living, millions of them. His mugshot was splashed across every paper, his eyes printed larger than life, his smirk analyzed like scripture. For a man who'd spent years invisible, it must have felt like resurrection. He sat there, thin, filthy, and oddly serene. God said he rarely spoke unless it was to joke about death. When asked if he feared execution, he shrugged. "We're all gonna die. I'll just get there first." He wasn't trying to sound profound. He just genuinely didn't care. The pre-trial hearings began in 1986 and instantly turned into theatre. He walked into court like it was a red carpet. Shackles on his ankles, sunglasses on his face, pentagram carved into his palm. He raised it toward the cameras and whispered, "Hail Satan." It wasn't rebellion, it was branding. The tabloids devoured it. "Devil in court! Satanic killer grins at death." The headline sold, and the myth grew legs. Meanwhile, prosecutors were quietly building a wall of evidence. Fingerprints, shoe prints, ballistic matches, DNA, eyewitnesses, and a mountain of circumstantial proof so high you could see the gas chamber from the top. But that wasn't the story people wanted. They wanted drama. They wanted the freak show. And Ramirez obliged. He laughed during testimony, flirted with reporters, called the judge an idiot, and smiled at jurors like he was auditioning for something. The audience didn't know whether to hate him or be hypnotized. Then came the letters. Hundreds at first, then thousands, most from women. Some sent lipstick kisses, some wrote poems, some sent nude photos. A few swore they were his spiritual wives. The guards started calling them the death row divas. It wasn't new. Bundy had fans, Manson had worshippers, but Ramirez added something new to the mix: fashion. His long hair, sunken cheekbones, and black clothes gave him a morbid Rockstar aesthetic that the media couldn't resist. When the press dubbed him the first satanic sex symbol, Anton LaVey's Church of Satan officially disavowed him. They reminded everyone that their doctrine had nothing to do with ritual murder. It didn't matter. The public wasn't interested in theology. They wanted a devil they could photograph. The trial dragged on for nearly 4 years, delayed by appeals, disruptions, and endless legal technicalities. Courtrooms filled daily with spectators who treated it like matinee entertainment. Outside, vendors sold bootleg t-shirts with his mugshot printed across them. There were postcards, buttons, even commemorative keychains. America has a special talent for turning tragedy into merchandising. When Ramirez finally testified, he did what everyone expected. Nothing useful. He rambled, contradicted himself, and occasionally stared off into the distance as if listening to something no one else could hear. Some believed the satanic posturing was an act, that the devil was just camouflage for delusion. Others thought he was exactly what he claimed to be. A man who stopped pretending to be human a long time ago. On September 20th, 1989, the jury returned with 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The judge read each count slowly. Ramirez listened, expressionless, until the end, when he finally smiled and said, "Big deal. Death always comes with the territory." And then, leaning toward the microphone as if giving a closing monologue, he added, "You make me what I am. I'll see you in hell." That was his last performance as a free man. The audience gasped. Some clapped. The judge didn't even look up. The sentence, death by gas chamber at San Quentin. Reporters filed their last dispatches. Courtroom spectators dispersed, and television anchors wrapped up the story with satisfied gravitas. Justice, they said, had been served. But somewhere inside that concrete fortress up north, the man who once strutted under flashing lights now sat alone in a 6x9 cell. No spotlight, no cameras, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of distant footsteps echoing down death row. He was finally in the one place where the night couldn't follow him. And for the first time in his life, it might have been too quiet. San Quentin sat like a fortress on the bay, half prison, half mausoleum. Fog rolled in from the water and wrapped itself around the towers like smoke from a ritual. It looked peaceful from a distance, almost sacred. Up close, the air tasted of rust and bleach. Inside, California stored its monsters like old weapons it didn't know how to dismantle. Richard Ramirez arrived there in 1989, 29 years old, sentenced to die. The guards called him Night Stalker, never Richard. Fame follows you, even through metal detectors. On the paperwork, his new address was simple: San Quentin State Prison, East Block, Death Row. His cell was barely 2 meters wide. 1 bed, 1 toilet, 1 shelf. The window looked out onto nothing. Every morning, guards slid his food through a slot. Once a day, he got an hour in the yard, a small patch of concrete wrapped in chain link and sky. It was there he smoked his endless cigarettes, pacing in slow circles, pale and unbothered. Prison staff expected a maniac. What they got was unsettling calm. He joked with guards, read books about Satanism and philosophy, and sent occasional letters to journalists who promised him attention. He drew pentagrams on envelopes, signed off with "Hail Satan" like a corporate signature. He still had fans. Hundreds wrote to him, declaring love or devotion, sometimes both. Some mailed him money. Some mailed him perfume-soaked letters. Some mailed him nude photos. Psychologists call it hybristophilia, the attraction to violent men. Ramirez simply called it proof that I matter. One of those letters came from Doreen Leoy, a freelance magazine editor who saw in him what she called a misunderstood soul. She started writing him in 1985, long before the trial ended. 75 letters later, she was visiting him regularly, describing him to the press as gentle and funny. In 1996, they married in the prison visiting room under fluorescent lights and armed supervision. The ceremony was brief. He wore a blue jumpsuit and handcuffs. She wore red lipstick and delusion. When the warden pronounced them husband and wife, Ramirez smiled for the cameras and whispered, "Forever in darkness." The tabloids exploded. "Death Row Romeo," screamed one headline. "Satan finds his bride," another. For years, Leoy defended him publicly. She claimed his innocence, insisted he was framed. Her family cut ties. The marriage lasted longer than anyone expected, nearly a decade, before she quietly disappeared from public view. By 2009, even she had stopped visiting. Time inside San Quentin moved differently. Outside, new killers stole headlines, new nightmares were televised. Inside, Ramirez aged poorly. The meth and malnutrition of his youth caught up with him. His teeth decayed to black stumps. His skin took on a greyish hue. Inmates said he smelled faintly of cigarettes and cold iron. He painted occasionally. Crude sketches of skulls, serpents, and pentagrams. Some of his artwork sold through murderabilia collectors online, fetching hundreds of dollars from people who wanted a piece of evil to hang above their sofa. The prison tried to stop it. Capitalism always wins. Interviewers who managed to get in described him as articulate but detached. He spoke in riddles, alternating between defiance and boredom. "You can't kill me," he told one journalist in the early 2000s. "I live in your nightmares." It sounded profound until you realized it was the only place he still lived. Then came the diagnosis: B-cell lymphoma, an aggressive form of cancer. Treatment was minimal. He refused most medical interventions, sometimes out of pride, sometimes out of pure fatalism. The devil doesn't do chemotherapy. He spent his last years isolated, weaker, still surrounded by letters from women who'd never met him. One wrote, "You showed me what freedom really means." Another, "You're my angel in darkness." The irony would have been funny if it weren't so bleak. In June 2013, before California could execute him, Ramirez finally ran out of time. He died in Marin General Hospital at age 53. Complications from cancer, hepatitis C, and decades of self-destruction. No satanic ceremony, no final words, just a flat line. The prison cremated him. No family came. Doreen Leoy was nowhere to be found. His ashes were never claimed. The man who once declared himself eternal vanished like cigarette smoke in sea fog. When the news broke, social media turned it into spectacle again. Memes, documentaries, hashtags. The same machine that had made him famous recycled his death for content. Someone even made a playlist called Songs the Night Stalker would like. San Quentin didn't mark his cell. The number changed. Another inmate moved in. The guard said the air in that corridor stayed cold for weeks. And maybe that's the truest ending. No fire, no brimstone, just silence. And a world that keeps finding ways to romanticize monsters long after they stop breathing. When Richard Ramirez died, you'd think the story would finally be over. But death, in his case, was just another release date. Within hours, the internet picked up where San Quentin left off. Twitter turned his mugshot into an aesthetic. Tumblr called him darkly beautiful. YouTube turned court clips into edits with moody synth music. It's amazing what happens when memory meets an algorithm. Netflix rolled out Night Stalker, the hunt for a serial killer in 2021, marketing it with that same black and red palette that used to sell horror movies in the 80s. Viewers binge-watched the footage of blood-stained carpets and whispered interviews. Some called it disturbing, others called it fascinating. Either way, it trended. What people rarely realized is that the show wasn't just about Ramirez. It was about how America turned fear into entertainment. The same headlines that once warned, "Lock your doors," now whispered, "Don't forget to subscribe." The fascination wasn't new. Decades earlier, Ramirez's fan mail had already predicted it. Women wrote him in cursive loops, convinced they saw something others didn't. He'd become a mirror for obsession, a figure people could project darkness onto, safely from the distance of a screen. The merchandise came next. Etsy shops sold replicas of his pentagram ring. True crime forums debated his handwriting. Teenagers posted TikToks saying he was hot but evil, like that was a genre. Someone even tattooed his face on their thigh. It's not love. It's pathology with better Wi-Fi. Meanwhile, the real legacy, the victims, got footnotes. The documentaries mention their names, sure, but briefly, like obligations. Because the monster always steals the stage. Ramirez had killed, assaulted, and tortured across 2 counties. Yet his face ended up on t-shirts while their names faded into search engine oblivion. There's something disturbingly efficient about that cycle. Every generation rediscovers him, repackages him, and calls it analysis. Podcasts dissect his psychology between ad reads for mattresses and meal kits. TikToks quote his lines in slow motion. The devil doesn't even need new followers anymore. He's automated. The Satanism angle never really died either. After his arrest, church groups blamed him for corrupting youth. Now online communities quote his interviews like scripture. His "Hail Satan" moment became a meme long after anyone cared about theology. Ironically, the real Church of Satan still insists they had nothing to do with him. But nuance never trends. In some way, Ramirez benefited from timing. The 80s had birthed the satanic panic, when every crime with a pentagram was proof of hell's PR department. Parents banned heavy metal, churches held exorcisms for cassette tapes. Ramirez just walked into the cultural storm already brewing and made it literal. When Netflix revived his story, survivors and detectives spoke up again. Some angry, some exhausted. Gil Carrillo, the cop who hunted him, said he still dreamt of the case. Others refused to watch it all. For them, Ramirez was not a myth, just a man who broke into their lives with a hammer. And yet the world couldn't look away. Serial killers in the algorithmic age became brands. Bundy got documentaries, Dahmer got dramatizations, Ramirez got aesthetic lighting and lo-fi remixes. We've turned horror into comfort food. The most interesting part? Ramirez would have loved it. The fame, the fixation, the digital immortality. In one old interview, when asked how he wanted to be remembered, he said, "Doesn't matter, as long as I am." And he was right. He still is. There's no haunted motel this time. No pentagrams scrawled in blood, just pixels, clicks, and streams. His evil became content. His smirk a thumbnail. We've replaced fear with fascination, and sometimes that's worse. Because the Night Stalker is long dead, but the attention he fed on, that's still alive, endlessly scrolling. And that's how the story ends, not with fire or justice or some holy revelation. Just silence, a hospital bed, and the faint sound of the Pacific hitting the prison walls. The Night Stalker is gone, but the myth he left behind still hums through documentaries, TikToks, and hashtags. Evil has Wi-Fi now. If you made it this far, breathe. Maybe turn on a lamp. Maybe double check the lock. Old habits die hard. If you like this dark little descent, hit like, subscribe, or drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. Would you rather meet a real monster or just watch one on Netflix? This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you've been listening to Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Sleep tight, and don't answer the knock at the window.